All right, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Welcome. And I invite, if you guys want to come closer to the front. I have been talking a lot today, so hopefully my voice is strong enough you can hear me back there. Welcome to the third session for this year's basic series on the visual gospel. We've had an introduction. We learned how to pray with sacred art in our first section. Then in our second session, we looked at beauty specifically, looking at the different aspects of it, both the subjective aspect of beauty, the objective aspect. And today we're going to look at three authentically Christian traditions of sacred art: the icon, the Gothic, and the Baroque art. So as we start into it, we're going to pray. We're going to end with our Lectio Divina, like we did last time, praying with a sacred image. And to begin, we're going to use the prayer before study. So let us pray together. Incomprehensible Creator, the true fountain of light and only author of all knowledge, deign, we beseech Thee, to enlighten our understanding and to remove from us all darkness of sin and ignorance. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of those who lack utterance, direct our tongues and pour on our lips the grace of Thy blessing. Give us a diligent, obedient spirit, quickness of apprehension, capacity of retaining, and the powerful assistance of Thy holy grace, that what we hear or learn we may apply to Thy honor and the eternal salvation of our own souls. Amen. All right. Well, still a brief review of what we looked at last time. We looked at certain characteristics of sacred art that we should be able to see shine through the different sacred art traditions that we see today. So sacred art, the church says, should be truly worthy, becoming, and beautiful. A beauty that has both a subjective and objective aspect. So it's subjective because we interact with it. We're subjects. And the artist is also a subject. But then also objective aspects, that there's an integrity, harmony, clarity of showing forth the interior of what a thing is. There's unity and variety. And then we talked about holistic abstraction. So we're not trying to simply photographically imitate things around us, nature, but instead we abstract certain aspects of it to put forth really what is this thing, not just exteriorly, but what is it meant to be. Noble beauty, not ostentation. So not noble simplicity, some might think, but not ostentation. So there's this order to all the parts. We can't have iconoclasm. We learned about that, the destroying of images. Historically, it's not a valid option because of the incarnation. To destroy the images would basically be to deny that Christ became the icon of the invisible God. Its sources are going to be drawn from salvation history, the story of our salvation. It's going to be both liturgical and sacramental. It's going to be united with the places where we worship and form an important part of the worship itself. And it's going to be created from the artist's own contemplation of the divine mysteries in order to lead those who see it into the contemplation of divine mysteries. And ultimately, it's not something that is the artist's or the viewer's own, but it's a gift from God. It leads us further than ourselves. So we saw some of those characteristics last time. So this time what we're going to do is we're going to look at three Christian art traditions, the Iconographic, Gothic, and Baroque. And I didn't choose these arbitrarily because I'm not that much of an art person to know that. These actually come from Ratzinger, or Benedict. Before he became Pope, he wrote in one of his books, Spirit of the Liturgy, he talked about Christian art. And he upheld these three traditions really as the high standards, the models for what Christian art is like. So I've got a couple images. So that's a Gothic church in Wrocław in Poland that I saw when I was there, and this is a chapel in Italy, which I didn't see. But it has so that's Gothic. This has those paintings in there are Baroque, and they're Caravaggio We'll see one of those in more detail later. So even though we're going to look at these three, the church does say that, with the treasury of art that's come through the centuries, one of our roles is to preserve it, not just in a museum, but where it rightfully needs to be. I mean, it was made to be part of the liturgy, and that's really where it ought to be preserved. So the church hasn't adopted any particular style of art as her own. So even though these three are the models, but there's no style of art that the church says, okay, it only can be Gothic and it can't be anything else. The church doesn't do that. Now, as we looked at last time, it should discern that some things are suited and some things are not, right? So that's what it says, provided that it adorns the sacred buildings and holy rites with due reverence and honor. So we still have to discern, but it's more open to just those three traditions. And my sister Rachel has been helping me. She's not here yet, but she would like me to state, well, probably the Renaissance. She really likes the Renaissance. But it's interesting, the Pope didn't include the High Renaissance in those three. So those three, reflecting on these three, there's an artist, David Clayton, and he kind of juxtaposed those art traditions with something that John Paul II reflected on. He reflected upon the three states of man throughout salvation history, and in his theology of the body. And in his theology of the body, he talked about the three states. First was original man. That's man before the fall. Before original sin enters the world. And then historical man, which is the time after the fall in which we're trying to move back towards God. That includes the time of the Old Testament after the fall, all the way up until Christ's coming, time of the church, leading us to heaven. And then the third one is eschatological man. The eschaton is basically the last things, the end things, heaven, hell, purgatory. So man in heaven. And so he's reflecting on this. The artist David Clayton said, well, the different art forms really fall into these different categories. We can start with the oldest of the forms is the iconographic. The icon we'll find is really showing heaven. So it fits in showing eschatological man as he would look in heaven. So we're going to see the characteristics with icons are not, in a sense, primitive, even though sometimes the shapes and forms and the way things are drawn in there to our modern eye might look more primitive. They're not, actually. It's not because they didn't know how to draw. They didn't know what a human person looked like, but because they purposely did it this way, because they weren't showing earth, they were showing heaven. Then both the Baroque and the Gothic art forms are showing historical man. Baroque, different characteristics within it, especially man here on earth, God coming down to us, to meet us. And the Gothic is kind of an art on pilgrimage. So it's, in a sense, a transition from man on earth to man in heaven. So we'll see how the characteristics that we see within these different art forms kind of show that through. And it's interesting, there is no artistic tradition showing original man. So maybe that can be a new artistic tradition. How do we portray through different symbolism, man before the fall? I don't know. So first one we're going to look at is iconography. And this is going to show us heaven. So this is the first form of Christian art. So all Christian art before 1200, both in the East and the West, was all considered to be part of this iconographic type. In the West, you get different forms under Celtic, Carolingian, Romanesque icons. And then in the East, depending upon which country you're in, there's slight differences between the different forms of icons that you see there. But between all of these, there are some similar elements. So this is one of my favorite icons. You may have seen this one before. If you've been in our sacristy here at St. Columkille, then we have a, not this original, or even a copy of the original, but we have another artist who imitated this form. So this is by the Russian painter Andrei Rublev from the 15th century. And it's an image both of the hospitality of Abraham. So the three angels that visit Abraham and Sarah to announce to them that they will have a son. But it also represents the Trinity. So one thing I always point out to the kids that's really neat is if you look at those three angels, look at their faces. And what the artist has done with their faces. They're all the same. So even though there's three angels, all the faces are very much the same. So three persons, but one God for the Trinity. So it's one of my favorite icons. And we'll look back again at that one, some more other elements within this icon. So let's look at some of those Western traditions first. This is some examples of Celtic iconography. So you can see it's very different from that last one we just looked at. These two are from the Book of Kells. One's Christ the King, and the other is Mary, the Madonna and Child. The book is from about the 800s. And does anyone recognize? Yeah. Where did we find this one?
Where are we in the chapel?
In the chapel here. We have a copy of it on the door of the tabernacle inside the chapel. So there it is right there. So why would you think that we have a Celtic icon in our church? For St. Columcille, yeah. And in fact, part of the tradition it may be, well, we really don't know, but maybe it was the monks from his monastery that worked on the Book of Kells. So it's very unique in it's very Celtic and all the knots and everything that you see in there, and the different imagery. So you might not think of this right away as being an icon, but it really is. Some of the characteristics we'll see later is that in icons, almost always the people are looking straight forward because they're showing heaven. And in heaven, you see everyone face to face. Everything is revealed fully to you. So you see God face to face, you see your neighbor face to face, and so the saints are always looking forward. If they're looking to the side, you can almost always see both of their eyes. Now the kids are always pointing out to me, it's like, well, what about Jesus then? It's like, well, sometimes they don't always follow. So compare that to, this is Carolingian iconography from the Ebo Gospels. So these are the two of the evangelists, and does anyone know the symbolism to be able to tell who is who? Mm-hmm.
I believe St. Matthew has a human face.
Yep, that's correct.
The Gospel according to John has the ox.
Nope, not quite. So yeah, you're right. This is Matthew. It's got the human face. This is, it's kind of hard to tell. That's a lion. So the lion represents Mark. The angelic creature that looks like an ox is Luke, and then John's looks like an eagle. And the way you can remember that is Matthew. He is the one with the human face, because Matthew is writing to the Hebrew people, to the Jewish people, and Mark, he has the lion because in his gospel, Jesus is portrayed as, in the way that it's written, it says, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. So it's Jesus, in a sense, always on the move, prowling about like a lion. Then Mark, he writes for the poor, the lowly, so he has the working animal, the ox. And John has the highest theology of all four, so he soars above like the eagle. So we see those four gospel writers in many places. This is Romanesque iconography from Spain, the 1100s. So you notice an image that you find a lot in icons is kind of Christ's transcendence. Him seated on a throne as judge. The word that they use for the Greek name for Christ seated on a throne is called the Pantocrator. So here Jesus seated on his throne. He's surrounded by those four creatures that represent the gospel writers. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So in there they have angels with an animal next to them. So it's kind of a different variety. Alpha and Omega. He's the beginning and the end. And the book that he's holding says Ego Sum, which means I am. It's God's name that he revealed to Moses. Jesus is holding it there, enthroned in glory. Yeah.
So, just out of curiosity, if this was made in the 1100s and they already have those animals attributed to them,
Yeah.
who,
Where did those animals come from?
like, who did that if it was already?
Animals come from the prophet Ezekiel.
Okay.
It comes from one of his visions, the four living creatures from Ezekiel, and then it's repeated in the book of Revelation. And so those four creatures actually, they represent the four strongest creatures in the Jewish mind. And so they became I'm not sure when the very first, must have been very, very early, that they were already attributed to or used to symbolize the four gospel writers. So, yeah. I don't know specifically when it started, but here's another. This is the so this one was a painting in the apse of the church. So the kind of the round part in the back of the church behind the altar. And this is another apse. This is in the Church of San Clemente in Rome. And instead of being painted, this is mosaic. So the little pieces of glass or ceramic or whatever they made it out of, placed up, put together, and then taken up and placed within the ceiling to form this this image. So once again, you see in some of the same iconographic themes. You know, across the top there, you've got Jesus in the center as the Pantocrator seated in judgment. To his right and to his left, you have the four living creatures representing the gospel writers. Along the sides, you have some of the saints like Agios Paulus, St. Paul, and Agios Petrus on the other side, St. Peter. And then in the center, you have this this wonderful image of the cross. You don't get a lot of crosses, crucifixes in iconography, but when you do, it's not so much shown as, you know, the actual physical sufferings of Christ on the cross. It's more like Jesus in glory placed on the cross, because it's showing heaven. It's not showing earth. So here we have Christ on the cross, and out of the doves representing, what do you think? What's a dove usually represent? Holy Spirit, yes. Be brave. No. Holy Spirit, yes. Representing the Holy Spirit, we have Mary and John, and then out of the bottom of the cross, it's called the cross is the tree of life. So it makes you think back to the tree of life in the Garden of Paradise with Adam and Eve. But then Christ and his cross becomes the new tree of life in heaven. So you get these images coming from the first garden being placed in heaven as the final paradise. But coming out of it, you have this plant growing up out of the bottom of the cross, and you have vines coming out. So if you recall, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. So he has these vines coming forth from him, and then in the midst of the vines, you see the life that's attached to those branches. You see different people and angels and animals, all part of this gathering their life from the tree of life. From the tree of life, too, comes the waters of grace, as the deer long for flowing streams. And then you got the apostles, Christ in the center of the sheep. The words around the top is Gloria in excelsis Deo, the glory to God in the highest, song of heaven. So a lot, and then the background. What color is the background? Gold. And we see that a lot in icons. They use the gold background because it's showing heaven filled completely with God's light. In fact, you don't see much shadow at all in an icon, because shadow would represent darkness. But there is no darkness in heaven. It's completely filled with God's light. His light is everywhere. So you can especially see that in this. This is iconography. This is produced a little bit later. It's not the very first original one that was here in the apse of St. Paul's outside the walls in Rome. The original church was from the 400s, but this was built. The mosaic was put up in 1220 by Venetian artists. But it's still the same iconographic style that you see in there. So that you see a number of different iconographic elements that are spread throughout of different icons. You've got the very gold background. The light's coming from everywhere. There's no shadows anywhere. Even the light comes forth out of the saints. So if you look at icons very closely, you look at their if you look into their eyes, if you look into your neighbor's eye right now, you'll notice a glint in their eyes because it's reflected from somewhere else, some other source. But in icons, they purposely remove the glint from the person's eyes because the light is coming through the saint. The light's everywhere, so there is no reflected light. Everything is a source of light because everything is filled with God's grace, His life. So that's another way in which the iconographic artist is trying to show heaven, not earth. It's not because they didn't realize that people had glints in their eyes. It's because they purposely removed it to make a theological statement. Also, the relative sizes of people are changed. Here, Christ is much larger than everybody else. I mean, Jesus is taller than them, and he's seated. So standing, he would be much taller. Represents the relative importance of people as to the size that they are. In fact, when I show this to the kids in the school, they always want to know about the turtle at the bottom, right down here. And I have to explain to them, well, it kind of looks like a turtle, but it's not a turtle. It's actually a person, and his name's right next to him. It's Pope Honorius III, who was the one who commissioned this work of art. You can see his name across up at the top in that medallion there. So he's a really tiny pope. No. What the artist is once again saying, a theological statement through this use of the relative changing the sizes. You know, Christ is indeed the most important, and the Pope, if a Pope comes into this church to celebrate Mass, he sees the Pope up there. It's like, yes, you may be important because you are the vicar of Christ and you're the head of the church here on earth, but your importance only lies in the fact because you serve Christ. So there is the Pope made very small. He's kneeling down and he's washing the feet of Christ. He's serving Christ. So some of the elements that you see in iconographic. Here in the same church, St. Paul, well, actually, let's talk about first that. A lot of times in icons, you get to see, they're helpful and they put the names of saints in there. So that helps out a lot sometimes when you're trying to figure out who they are. So obviously, that means Jesus. The IC is the Greek letters, a J and an S. Jesus. The X is a Chi. That's in there. Jesus Christus, Jesus Christ. The bar across the top basically means fill in the rest of the word. And then you have St. Luke and St. Paul and St. Peter and St. Andrew. And you'll have to look on your own as to what the writings say, because I can't read all that. All right, in the same church, we have this triumphal arch. The apse is back here that we were just looking at. And there's a triumphal arch you see again. This set of icon, this arch is actually older. This comes from the 5th century, so closer to the time that the church was built. And so you see once again Jesus, the Pantocrator, the 4 living creatures surrounded by the white-robed army of the saints. So some of the other elements you see in there are from other eras. So like the ornate ceiling that you see there, that comes from the 1800s, I think. So a lot of those old churches, you get elements from all sorts of different periods of time as each generation added their own kind of stake in the church or whatever. So here is another church, another iconographic mosaic. This is the Hagia Sophia. And this is in a side apse of the church. The Hagia Sophia, if you know anything about it, was in Constantinople. It was built in the 800s. Constantinople is now Istanbul in Turkey. So in 1453, it became a mosque, and in 1935, it became a museum. So you see the Islamic elements in it. So for example, these circular medallions have kind of Arabic writing language in there. So that's some of the Arabic, the Islamic art that was added into the Hagia Sophia. But they retained this icon of our Blessed Mother with Christ on her, because they do honor Mary. They don't think her son was God, but they do honor her. So I just thought it's wonderful that survived. We still have that example of Christian art within this wonderful church building. So we go on this is especially in the Eastern churches, in the Eastern traditions, icons became so important to them that in a sense they almost built their churches entirely out of icons. So you see this church from the Ukraine. It's in Kiev, St. Sophia Cathedral. You see the icons everywhere. Some of the oldest icons on the side, got some of the back, the other side, and then the newest, this wall of icons. It's called an iconostasis. That's from the 18th century. So the iconostasis is really an incredibly important part to Eastern churches' liturgy. I don't know enough about Eastern churches' liturgy, all the Eastern churches, to say that it's important in all of the different varieties. But in many of them, it is, especially in the Eastern Orthodox as well. So you got the Orthodox; those are the ones that are not in full communion with the Catholic Church, and then the Eastern Catholic churches, which are in full communion with the Catholic Church. But regardless, both of them celebrate Mass. It looks different from our Roman Rite, but they celebrate Mass, and a part of their celebration of the liturgy involves the use of the iconostasis. So here is a iconostasis from a cathedral. It's a Russian Orthodox cathedral in Russia. And so iconostasis is basically, it's a wall of icons, and it's found between the nave, which is the place where everybody sits, and the sanctuary, the place where the priest celebrates the Mass. And it's really strange to think of it in this way, because for us here in the Western Church, we like to see everything that's going on, and we don't like it if there's something in the way. But they're celebrating the liturgy, and they're going to be behind this wall of icons, so you can't see what's happening. But as I was explaining to the kids in the schools, well, how many of you can see the priest actually change the bread and the wine into Christ's body and blood? How many of you have ever seen that occur? I mean, have you seen the actual change happen? No, you have to rely upon faith. You can't actually see it happen. You have to be drawn into the great mystery that heaven and earth is meeting at this moment in the sanctuary, in this holy place. But you can't see it. Well, and so those in the Eastern churches would agree, yeah, you can't see it. So let's have something assist us to be able to see it. So what they do is they put a wall of icons there, because icons show heaven. And so now they can enter into heaven much easier. So for us, in our mind, we would think this is like a barrier, but they would not at all see this as being a barrier between the nave and the sanctuary. Instead, it's something that connects them to what's going on in the sanctuary. So, I mean, it goes all the way back to the tent and the temple in the Old Testament. The tent between we'll talk about this more next time when we talk about theology of church architecture. You've got the first part of the tent or temple, which you could call the nave, and then the Holy of Holies, or the sanctuary. And it was separated by a veil. And only the high priest was allowed to go back there, and then Yom Kippur, the high priest would go back there and bring the sins of the people to be forgiven. So the theology builds upon the veil of the temple, which at that time was more like a barrier. But now, in the Eastern Church, they have the iconostasis. And then during the Mass, there would be points in which the priest would come out the main doors, or the deacon through the side doors. And so you'd be able to see in somewhat, and he'd bring heaven out to you. So I've never actually been to a liturgy, but it would be fascinating to see it. So there's all sorts of different stuff. In the West, we actually have our own kind of versions of the veil, of what the veil transformed into. We'll talk more about that when I go into church theology. So they're not quite as elaborate as the iconostasis, but we do have, through the history of the West, we've had a version of some kind of connecting portion. So this iconostasis is from the 17th century. It's in a monastery in Russia, and at its high point, they kind of developed in the Eastern churches this theology of what should be in an iconostasis. So we see, with some variety, certain icons that they include. So at the bottom, they have the beautiful gate, which is the gate for the priest to go in and out. The Theotokos, Mary, and the Pantocrator, Jesus enthroned, would be on either side of the door. Then they would list the 12 great feasts at some point, and they might interchange some of these in the order from top to bottom. But the 12 great feasts, and actually I was talking to somebody who knew a little more art than I do, but they were saying that about the Easter, and they were saying that on the feast day for one of these great feasts, like say, Easter, they would take the icon down from the iconostasis and place it in the place of prominence in front. So it's kind of neat. They, I don't know if all of them do that, or I don't know too much about it, but it's just kind of fascinating. Then you have Christ enthroned, Theotokos with John the Baptist, archangels. As you go up, you have a row of Old Testament characters, and then also the 12 apostles. And of course, there's some variety with the iconostases. Here's a more modern one. This is from a Ukrainian Greek Catholic church in Chicago. It was built in 1956. So you can see this iconostasis is a little more open, so you can kind of see through it. But then during the liturgy, you have this curtain that would close in the altar that we can see back there. So you can really see how the icon was really, it's an important part of the liturgy itself. It's not just to adorn an additional adorning of the space, but it actually is part of the liturgical action itself. And there's probably much more that, if I were an Eastern priest, we'd probably have like a whole series on icons. I talked about some of these things, about the uncreated, about the light that's everywhere, the gold backgrounds, so you're not going to see a whole lot of scenery. And the scenery that you do see is going to be simplified, almost geometric at times. Kind of way. There's no reflected glint in the eye. There's no contrast between light and darkness, no shadows. So the Black Madonna that we saw last time, Our Lady of Czestochowa, is definitely an example of an icon. We looked at the faces of the saints themselves are being transformed to become more like the divine nature of God. So you don't see a lot of feelings within them, and the kind of feelings that you do are suggestions of virtues, purity, patience, forgiveness, and love. Sometimes it would be referred to as a bright sadness. Not because they are sad because they're in heaven, but it's part of that element of them praying for those who are not yet with them. So other aspects of them, they see very thin hands, expressive fingers, blessing many times. Clothing is very stylized. It's not trying to show the smooth flowing folds of the cloth, but becomes almost geometric. at times. So you can see more in the examples of different styles. And I don't have the citation of this one, sorry. We look at, I use these because you can really see some of the exaggerated features of the saint. So we got St. Columkill on one side and St. Kevin, my patron, on the other side. Notice that they have really big foreheads. That's because of their wisdom. Their wisdom, and then they have really big ears. The better to hear God's word with. No. And really big eyes, the better to see God with. No. And big noses. They smell the fragrance of heaven. The holy incense rising. But their mouths are very small because they speak very little. And what they do speak is always the word of God. So there's this overarching sense of silence that comes out of icons. You never see the people portrayed as speaking to one another in an icon. They're never speaking. So there's a kind of silence within them that's meant to lead us into the silent prayer as part of it. So icons also, they will change time and space because they're showing heaven. So the way time works here on earth is different from the way time would go by in heaven. So God's eternity, he sees everything all at once, whereas we have to see one thing after another. So I have to spend all day working. No. Well, we could just do it all at once, one moment. And they'll also alter space. So let's look at time first. So different events that happen throughout the life of a saint will be portrayed as happening at the same time. So here we have an icon of John the Baptist. St. John the Forerunner, John the Baptist, and we see him simultaneously receiving revelation from God that he's going to be preaching, and also his head on the platter, having been martyred. So obviously he didn't do that at the same time. But the icon is showing both together because they're both eternal realities of the St. John. And the interesting thing about this icon is John's portrayed with wings, not because he's an angel. We don't become angels in heaven. But angel, the word angel means messenger. And John the Baptist was the forerunner, the messenger, right before Christ. So they have him portrayed with the wings to represent his role as that divine messenger. So here's another example of that, an icon where you have many events being shown at once. So what set of mysteries of the Rosary is this showing? The joyful mysteries, yes. Very good. You got the Annunciation, the Visitation, the birth of Mary and Joseph in the dream with the angel. You've got presentation in the temple and the finding of Jesus in the temple. So, my sister's here. Do you want to come talk about the next picture? You don't know what's coming up next. So now we're going to talk about how, so they change time, and then in icons too, they also change space. They do something a little bit different. A lot of times if you go up like on a high point and you look out far, what do you see? What happens as you look further and further away? Things get smaller, right? So, and at a point, they just disappear. So our perspective is of things vanishing at a certain point. So in art, they call that the vanishing point. So in art, they use this form of perspective. Right, Rachel? Yes. So you want to say anything about how you use? So this is a painting of my sister's. Okay, sorry. It is a piece of art by my sister in which she utilized linear perspective. Okay, I'll explain it. Fine. She uses linear perspective. So you see on both the streets, the lines go back to vanish at a certain point. They're vanishing points. See that on both sides. And so that makes it look more realistic. It gives the depth to the image because there's a foreground and a background. The lampposts are taller and get shorter as they go back. So you can very clearly see it, and it makes it look realistic. Well, icons don't do this. That's what most icons look very flat. So that there isn't any perspective. In fact, what they do, it's not because they don't know or realize that, like, if you look and you see things that are far away, that they start to disappear. I mean, they were smart people. So what they did was they purposely reversed it, because they're like, we're not going to show earth, we want to show heaven. So a symbol of that is, let's invert the perspective. So we call it that, reverse perspective. Instead of going backwards and to a vanishing point, they reverse it, and it comes forward, and in a sense the vanishing point comes outside the painting. So if you look at this icon of the Trinity by Rublev, you can see some of that. If you look at the building up here, the mountain, and then down here at the bottom, see that the lines of perspective go the opposite direction. And they're doing this on purpose, because they're showing heaven, not earth. This one might be easier to see too. So you see the two buildings in the background. You can see how the vanishing point's coming forward. It's reverse perspective. Saints Joachim and Anne, the parents of Mary, and also the colors have much important meanings within icons. I'm not going to go through all of these colors. You've got it on your sheet there. If you want to look in more details at the colors. Of course, we already noticed that, for example, the gold, of how important that is. You see a lot of the backgrounds being gold. It's not 100%. There are some icons that I found that don't have gold backgrounds. Like, for example, the Black Madonna doesn't have a gold background, but many of them will have a gold background showing that uncreated light. The crimson on Christ, representing royalty, his priestly dignity. Also red. Here we got Jesus, having risen from the dead, is pulling Adam and Eve up out from the depths of the underworld. And so you've got red on them, which represents an energy, a new life. And then under them you have black, which represents evil or death. So just to name some of those colors within icons. There's a whole process of writing that someone would go through to make icons. It's not just simply they would not see this as just simply an expression of their own artistic abilities. It's very important for them for it to be embedded in prayer and in the tradition before them. It's not beginning with their own imagination. There's room, of course, for their own self to be placed in, but it's also very important to with revelation. Another reason why the paintings look very flat, there's not only because there's no perspective going backwards, but also the style of paint that they use is egg tempera, which is also why icons were painted on wood, because you needed a firm surface to prevent the egg tempera paint from cracking. But the egg tempera paint makes a very flat image, but it also makes the image colors in the icon very bright, because they would put the white background on first, and then they paint the colors over it, and that would really bring the white force. So I'm not going to talk about all those steps, but first graders actually learn how to make icons. So there's some of their icons they made. So and they have rules for doing their icons too, for praying, and they actually these are from previous years, but they actually just did their icons just before Thanksgiving. So here they are, little iconographers. So that completes the iconography. Let's take a break. And well, let's go ahead and begin again, looking at the Gothic time period. So this is going to be the. So we looked at heaven. We started in heaven, and now it's kind of going backwards on the actual salvation history. We go from earth to heaven, but we started with the icons because, in a sense, what we're doing here on earth right now only makes sense if we know where we're going. When I was in the seminary, our class we had a class that covered both eschatology. Remember the eschaton? That's the heaven, hell, end things, and creation in the same one. And we actually talked about end things before we talked about the beginning. Because then if you know where you're going, then where you start from, you can understand what it is. I mean, the purpose and meaning of creation makes much more sense when you know where it's headed to. So we're going to go back to looking at our path from earth to heaven, a pilgrimage there. So, like, I mentioned when we looked at the Black Madonna about my pilgrimage that I went on to see the Black Madonna in Poland, walking for 6 days from Krakow to Częstochowa. And so that's a pilgrimage pilgrimage is a trip to a holy place. Well, all of us are on pilgrimage, on trip to a holy place, the holy place, heaven. And so the Gothic is helping to visualize certain aspects. So we're gonna see elements of the iconographic tradition being retained, but then some transformation occurring as it begins to show this path to heaven. And one of the most important things that that constitutes the beginning of the Gothic era is the formation of a new church architecture. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on church architecture today because we're going to look at that next time. So this is really and I haven't yet looked at very many church buildings. So this is like one of the first church buildings we've shown. But it's important because this is the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis in France. I did that right, Rachel? Okay. And this is where it would be considered the first Gothic church building, 1135. So this is the same church in these two pictures. You'll notice that they don't look exactly the same. One's from the 1800s, the other one's a photo from today. And today it's missing something. It's church steeple, its tower is gone. In the 1800s, let's see, I think it was, yes, it was 1837. It was damaged by lightning. And then in 1840, 3 years later, it was damaged again by a storm. And so then it was disassembled the rest of the way to keep everything else from falling on people. And they started a committee in 1992 to consider its reconstruction. And they expect to begin rebuilding this year, the tower. So that'll be pretty cool. What you see in the Gothic is a kind of verticality. They're incredibly tall. I mean, look at the people down there at the bottom. Even the main part of the church, very tall building. And then you stick the steeple on it, and in like the 1800s, it's much, much higher than any other building around. So it does, these steeples does several things, and we're not going to spend too much time on it because we're going to look more at Gothic architecture next time. But you can see how it's already portraying pilgrimage just from the exterior of the building. Because first, wherever you happen to be in the world, meaning in the city that you're in, or the town, you can see the cross on the top. It's kind of cut off up there, I guess. But you can see the cross of the church steeple. And so wherever you happen to be working, you can see that above everything else. And so it draws your mind back to the eternal realities. Same thing when you're coming up close to the church. In order to take it in, it forces your eyes to go up. You look up, and that's a natural image for us of heaven, of things of God are up, they're transcendent. So just from the very exterior of the kind of architecture that you're going to see during this time period, here you are on the ground, but it's lifting you up. That pilgrimage towards our final destination. Now, also during this time period, what brought about this certain changes is that there was a new focus on naturalism, on looking at the natural world. Now, in scholarly terms, there was a rediscovery of Aristotle and his philosophy and his work of observing nature. So we might think mostly of him as being a philosopher, but he did a lot of just simply recording natural observations of different, like animals and things like that, and plants and things like that. So there became a greater curiosity of the world. It was during this time period that the scientific method has its origins, and there's a great understanding that though the world is fallen, it's still good. And in fact, God has given it to man to continue to be cultivated. So we can order those places in our world that are disordered back to God. That quote we saw last time. Oh, true. So there, we're going to see some differences in the Gothic, but we're also going to see some overlap with the iconographic tradition. So in icons, we saw how they emphasize Christ's transcendence, him seated on the throne, him as Pantocrator. Even when they happen to show a cross, it's not so much his agony, but him looking glorified even on the cross. Whereas in the Gothic, you see Christ more of his suffering, him sharing our suffering. You see him portrayed in more earthly terms. Also, you're going to see people, instead of looking straight forward, you're going to see people begin to be turned to profile. There's going to be more shadows, more areas of darkness, because there is darkness in the world. You're going to see more perspective. They're showing it more naturally. So it's things existing on Earth, so they're going to show it to look more like Earth. Though you're still going to see certain elements that carry on from the iconographic. There's still going to be a certain emotional distance, though more emotions will be shown than the bright sadness of icons. You're still going to see halos and uncreated light coming from the saints, though depends upon which part of the Gothic tradition you'll see it more or less. So it's this naturalism fused onto the iconographic substrate, because I just don't like, suddenly it's icons and then suddenly it's Gothic. It's a much more complex transition between the two. So, for example, if we look at Duccio from the 1300s, it's probably not a whole lot in here where you could say, well, is that Gothic or is that iconographic? Because there's a lot of elements in there that look very iconographic. You've got Mary and Jesus seated in the middle of the throne, so a very transcendent image. It's definitely a vision of heaven, because you've got the saints surrounding the throne. They've got their halos. You've got the gold background. You still even retain some of the like Mary's face, the large proportion for the nose. So it's still a lot of the elements of the Gothic here. Duccio was an Italian painter in Siena. And this painting is from the middle of an altarpiece. The Maestra, is that how you say it, Rachel? Okay, sorry. Yes, you do. No. So an altarpiece is basically, you've got the altar, and above the altar you have some kind of work of art, it's called the altarpiece. So we're going to see a number of these pieces of art are going to be attached to the altar. So this is the front of the altarpiece. See the main large painting and then several other smaller ones. And then here's the back of the altarpiece. So these are all Duccio. And so let's look a little bit closer at some of them. This one here is a scene of. Anyone? What's it showing? Yes, Christ calling the two apostles, Andrew and Peter. So the story, Christ comes to them. They've been fishing all day and they have no catch. They come in and Jesus tells them to throw their nets back out. And they take in a huge catch of fish that they can barely pull back. And then Christ calls them no longer to be fishermen, but fishers of men. So you can see, what makes you think of icon in this? Gold background, yeah. There's not a lot of scenery back there. There's the gold, uncreated light of the icon. I mean, even the halos kind of are fused to kind of disappear into that. Anything else that kinds of make you think of an icon?
The shape of the faces.
Yeah, the faces. You can see Jesus' nose is quite long. No, those are kind of shorter now. So there's some change to it. The faces, though, are looking pretty much, in all these, you can see both of their eyes. So it's still very much facing forward. Though you can see other elements. So, for example, on this hill, you see elements of shadow, which give that hill more depth, more perspective to it. So there's beginning to be a melt. And this next one, there's even greater melding of both icon and then this new naturalism. So what scene is this? Before you say it, look at it very carefully, because it's not what you think it is. I tricked some of the kids in the school on this one. Actually, I have to admit that, like, when I first brought in the first couple classes, I was telling them it was the wrong thing, and then one of the kids pointed out, "Father, what about that?" And then I was like, "Oh yeah, you're right. That's not what I was doing." So, what scene is this? After the resurrection. Because if you look at Christ, his hands are pierced. This is not the Last Supper. It is Christ appearing to the apostles in the upper room after the resurrection. Another interesting thing is, the way that Duccio has portrayed Jesus compared to the way he's portrayed the other apostles. What has he done? The gold lining of his clothes, and it looks that the way that he did that looks very similar to some icons that I've seen. So, at least in some of the iconographic traditions, this is a way in which they portray that uncreated light upon the clothes of the person. So here you can see Jesus having resurrected. He's also to the side that is got the gold by it, whereas everybody else is in the shadowy room. They're still closer to earth. Mm-hmm.
Should we take anything from the side of the halo? Shouldn't Jesus' halo be much bigger than
I mean, they're the same size of.
they're not holy?
Oh well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you're right. These in icons, all the saints would have halos. But in here, what he's done is he's retained the halos along the top, but on the bottom he's removed them so you can see the table better. So it's much more naturalism. You can see it. You can see the people easier you can see the. The scene easier because it's after the resurrection. They didn't have halos around their head. It's an artistic symbol. Mm-hmm. What the painting? Well, the painting. This is from this altarpiece. Yeah, it's let's see. There was the calling of the disciples, and I think it's right up here. Okay. Yeah, but the paint definitely has cracked. Another thing too, you see, what about these people down here that's different compared to icons? They're in profile. You only see half the face. In fact, the one guy looks very uncomfortable. Yeah, so you see there's this combination of elements going on here. Then the crucifixion scene on there. You see some more of you got the full gold background, but then Jesus on the cross is much more realistic. You show him suffering, the moment after his side has been pierced, the blood and water flowing from his side. I mean, even his halo disappears into the background. You can even when we zoom into some of those people, there's a lot more realistic details. I mean, the people no longer. I mean, none of those people are being portrayed with the exaggerated features. I mean, they're all much closer to natural features. And there's also, I mean, the hair, for example, the hair in icons are more stylized, whereas this hair is much more hair-like. So some of the kids were asking about who is who, and we figured out that, well, this must be the good thief, and this must be the bad thief, because of which side they're on for Christ. Right is always the good side when judgment, left is always the bad side. Looks like Mary and the saints, the disciples over here, and the crowd is on the other side. So you see, it's even portrayed the fact that Christ was pierced in the side, but the thieves' legs were broken. So you can even see that part on there. All right, so that's Duccio from that altar. Then Fra Angelico, blessed Fra Angelico. Dominican friar from Florence, and one of our patrons, if you're an artist, patron saint. Blessed Fra Angelico. This is the Day of Judgment, which is a theme that they liked a lot in the Middle Ages. See that a lot in their art. So you can see the changing of the style now. It's much less like an icon. There's no gold background anymore. Now you've got a blue sky. You still have a portrayal of, I mean, this part is the most iconographic part of it. You still got Jesus seated on the throne judging, and surrounded by the choirs of angels and saints. Here in the center, you've got the graves that have opened, and the dead have risen and are now being judged. And on the right, you have those that are judged in union with Christ. And you have all sorts of interesting, the more you look in, see who's in there. You've got all sorts. You've got there's a cardinal, and there's a nun, and there's regular people in there. You got the angels and saints leading them up into the heavenly Jerusalem. And then if you look on the other side, is hell. So whereas it gets brighter as you go this way, it gets darker in the shadows and darkness as you go into hell. And instead of the angels and saints leading the people into heaven, now you've got the demons, the fallen angels, herding people into the depths of hell. And if we were to zoom into that, you could see all of the wonderful horrors that Fra Angelico is portraying. Monsters eating people and being cooked in barrels or in tubs. But the interesting thing is that you'll know, if you look in here, once again, you see all people in here. There's a sister, there's a bishop there, there's a priest. So, theological statement. Yeah, this is in San Marco in Florence. That's where you find this. If you want to know, Fra Angelico was beatified by John Paul II in 1982. So, does anyone recognize this? Yep, it's our tabernacle at St. Columkill. And the artist John Leiba, who did the tabernacle, these tabernacle doors and the crucifix, he used as reference for these angels Fra Angelico. So they're based off of this painting in the San Marco Monastery in Florence. And it's found in a monk's cell. It's where their room that they live in. So you can see it's very much imitating Fra Angelico's Gabriel there, the Annunciation to Mary. So this looks a little bit more iconographic than the last one we looked at. But once again, you've got the earthliness of it. You've got the shadows in the ceiling. You've got the shadow behind Mary, the light emanating from what looks to be coming from Gabriel. Then behind them you have what's probably St. Dominic, founder of the Dominicans, Fra Angelico's order, and the monastery where this is at. So that's probably who that is. This is where it is. So that's their cell where the monks would live. And so you see what he did was he incorporated the architecture of the cell itself into the painting. So, their Dominic is St. Dominic in his monk cell, and he's having this encounter with this holy event, heaven breaking in, to the monk's prayer here in the ordinariness of their cell. It's kind of neat. Then on the other side of our tabernacle, if you happen to have been in there when the other side has been open, which is probably not quite as likely because it's not open very often, we do have the capability of doing Eucharistic adoration from the other side. On the interior, on the door, we have another angel, and that's a print of another one of Fra Angelico's angels. So it comes from the Perugia triptych. Triptych is tri, so it means like 3 panels. And many triptychs are ones that can open and close. This one's a permanently open one. It's also an altarpiece. In the St. Nicholas Chapel in San Domenico in Perugia, central Italy. So you see the this angel and the medallion on the top of one side. So it's very, it's got the gold background like an icon, but it uses the angel in profile, which is much more Gothic than iconographic. All right. Last time we prayed with this image of Fra Angelico's, the Annunciation. So it's attached to, that's another altar. So that's kind of what it looks more. Also during the Middle Ages, we already saw a couple illuminated manuscripts, the Book of Kells and the that other Carolingian manuscript. But this one was illuminated by Fra Angelico, and you can see this one specifically is an illuminated letter. The letter of this the introit for the entrance chant for the fourth Sunday of Advent, the Rorate Caeli. And so the beginning R has the image for Advent of the Annunciation. Gabriel visiting Mary, and then God portrayed as Christ, sending the Holy Spirit down upon her to receive that. So this chant manuscript is, I mean, the chant is still the same chant that can be used today for the liturgy. So this is what you can actually see. This you can actually kind of, well, if you know how to follow the square notes, you can follow them along with the music. It's not on yet. Okay. So their holy books were very important because, of course, they had no other means but to handwrite the manuscripts at this point. So there's their treasure; they become treasured works of art as they're illuminated by the monks who are writing them. So they decorate the initials are the initial texts, like the last one we just saw, the Rorate Caeli. There's another one. Also, they do marginalia, or fancy things around the borders of the pages, or a whole page with a miniature illustration within the book. So, I mean, you see these kinds of manuscripts very early, but most of the surviving ones we have come from the Middle Ages, and most of them are religious in nature because those are the ones that might have the greatest patronage of whatever was a lord or someone who wanted. I wanted illustrated Book of the Hours, So also during the Middle Ages, stained glass becomes very important. We'll look at its role in the church another time, but if we look at some of the theology of stained glass, within the church building, what you're going to do is going to be creating a heavenly light of the presence of God. In a different way than from the icon was portraying a heavenly light. So it really goes back to the construction of the temple in Jerusalem and being the involvement of gems on the vestments of the priests and gems used in the construction. So here the stained glass, the different colors of light are like gems on the walls. Also the image in the book of Revelation of the heavenly Jerusalem being made from gems. So we can use stained glass. Really becomes an analogy for helping to understand the relationship between us and God, between the saints and God. So in a stained glass, you can only see the full beauty of the stained glass if there's light shining through it. At nighttime and you're in the church, you can't really see the stained glass at all, unless you live in the middle of Omaha. No. And you got street lights. So you need God's light shining through the saints in order to see their full beauty. Saints become truly who they are. We become truly who we are when God's light shines through us. So our holiness is only possible because of God's holiness that's seen through us. Then stained glass shows So the colors already contained in white light that we don't normally see. Normally light is a single color, but then it breaks into its spectrum as it is refracted through the windows. So in the same way, we see God revealed to us through the saints. They are able to take those many facets of God's light and his love, and they're able to break it apart into specific details that we can see and comprehend. Also, if we just go outside and we try looking up straight at the sun, we'll go blind because we can't take it in. It's too intense. Instead, light coming through the stained glass softens it, and we're able to look at the light easier. We can see what's really there. So the same way, we can't see God directly, but instead he shines through those creatures that he's made here on earth. So in that way, we're able to see something about God. So, all of those elements come into, this use of stained glass coming here in the Gothic forms. And so this window comes from Saint Denis, the church I showed you earlier, the first Gothic church. And let's see, this is called someone has called it the anagogical window. So if you happen to come last year to the typology sessions we did, and anagogy means you've got something from the Old Testament used to represent some kind of moral truth. Anagogy is teaching about morals. So it's those kinds of things that are being taught through this window. And you got some, the extraordinariness of certain buildings with the stained glass. So this is Sainte-Chapelle, Holy Chapel. That's what that means, in Paris, in France. So becomes so. It's like the windows become so. All the walls are basically just windows now. So it's completely made of the gems. You get this really the feel of the heavenly Jerusalem, covered top to bottom with gems. And of course, we'll talk about more next time with the Gothic as to what they had to do architecturally in order to pull this off. Because if you just look at it like this, you're like, there's no way that ceiling can hold up. Because the windows can't hold that ceiling just like that. And so they'll have to create a new architectural element called the flying buttress in order to keep that ceiling up. So here's some details of a window. This is from the Chartres Cathedral. This is the Incarnation window. So we see elements of the Incarnation. We got the Visitation, the Annunciation, the Visitation, then the birth of Jesus there across the bottom, and then the next row we have the angels coming to the shepherds announcing Jesus' birth, and then we have the three wise. Those two panels are the three wise men meeting with King Herod. And across the top, you have the three wise men following the star to where Mary has the Christ child, and then the wise men leaving, and then it continues on up. The story continues on up the window that's not pictured. It's another example. This is from the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. This is the North Rose window. So there's more than one window. This is Mary is seated, and she's enthroned in the center with Christ. And then around the outside, you have various Old Testament kings and prophets in the medallions around the layers of the rose window. So on often the theology for these windows is that the Old Testament prophets would be on the north side, and then on the south side, which would be the side that the sun rises in the east, southeast, you have the New Testament figures being on the opposite side, south. Also in the Gothic time, you have a change in sculpture. And so in the iconographic style, they're showing heaven. So they're trying to destroy earthly space. They're trying to just like they did with the inverted perspective. So in sculptures, they limit it to relief sculptures. So it's attached into the wall, and there's a flatness to it. And so once again, you got the theme of the Pantocrator, Jesus enthroned in majesty. But then as you continue into the Gothic, this sculpture is going to start to emerge from the background to have more depth, more perspective to it. So these are some statues on. See, the first one was from Sainte-Foy, the French Gothic cathedral. Or no, that's that one. I can't read my notes on here. That one, this the middle one, or the next one is from Chartres Cathedral. So they're still attached to the side of the building, but you can see that there's a much more three-dimensionality to them. They're kind of coming out from the building now more than the previous. We also talked about last time too with abstract or holistic abstraction. They're elongating. There's this element of abstraction of the people. They're making them very, very tall because you've got the whole verticality of the building leading us on pilgrimage to heaven. And then finally you get to statues just on their own, without any kind of attachment to any wall. Just for some fun, Hieronymus Bosch from the Netherlands. It's almost like a medieval surrealism. If you are familiar with Salvador Dali, a surrealist artist. So this is his Garden of Earthly Delight. So there's some really weird looking stuff in there. If you spend time checking it out. You've got Paradise, Garden of Eden, and then you got the Garden of Earthly Delights where people are delighting in earthly things and going about sinning. And then you have the consequences of sin over here in hell. And so, like I mentioned earlier, that was one of the themes in the Middle Ages. They like to show forth the reality of hell. But we better not end on that for Gothic. So let's we'll finish with this one for the Gothic period. These are the 7 works of mercy. So that's the full length of it down here. We have the 7 works of mercy portrayed in each of these panels. And the neat thing about this is it's showing, this medieval life of them doing these works of mercy, is that in each of the crowds, as part of those being ministered to you have Jesus hidden in them. So they're feeding the hungry. There's Christ being fed. They're giving drink to the thirsty. There he is. They're clothing the naked. Jesus is part of them as well. The only one where he's not part is the middle one where we bury the dead. He's seated at judgment when one dies. So it's very interesting panels of showing forth the works of mercy. So icons were the first one we looked at, then the Gothic style. Late Gothic moving into the Renaissance. The high part of the Renaissance in Italy at the end of the 1400s. And after the Renaissance, there comes the issue of the Protestant Reformation and many pieces of art being destroyed. The iconoclasm that happened there. The church responds with the Council of Trent and the Catholic Reformation, and the Baroque style of art is going to be the style of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So, because Rachel would be mad at me if I just entirely skipped over the Renaissance, we have to talk about the Renaissance. No, at least a little bit. It's important. It's important. Even though the Pope mentions icons and Gothic and Baroque, the Renaissance is important, but it's in a sense, it's. I know you would like it. You don't like me saying that it's transitionary, but there's many wonderful things that come from it. But one of the big changes between Gothic to Renaissance is, there's 3 things that artists do in these traditions. The first is that they observe nature around them. Then they study harmonies, proportions, and then they study the old masters. So the big difference that occurred in the Renaissance was that they basically changed in who the masters were that they studied. And now they went back to Roman and Greek statuary and art, and they began to use those as ways, incorporating that into their artwork. So, for example, if we look at this, this is a statue of the second century Roman statue of Dionysius, god of fertility and wine, and you can see similarities in the features, in the way that the form of the body, the form of the face, is then included into artwork such as Raphael's. Raphael. What do you prefer, Rachel? Raphael's Alba Madonna on the top there, and then below it, David of Michelangelo. So you can see, I mean, they're using those forms, and another wonderful instance of seeing how this transition happened was if you look at a couple more of Raphael's work. This is a very early crucifix for him, crucifixion scene, and then on the other side is one of, I think it was his very last work, wasn't it? I think I remember reading that. Anyway, it's very late. It's very late, so you can see the change in the style is very different, even though they're the same artist. This does look very much more Gothic, whereas this is very something that we haven't seen yet coming out of it. Interesting thing is that what Raphael does in both of these is he incorporates the geometric patterns that he incorporates in here. He incorporates the octagon into there. So the octagon, the 8-sided figure, 7 days of creation, and then the resurrection is the 8th day. So the 8 sides you see a lot in like baptismal fonts, and here he's representing the birth into new life. Here he's used it in the scene of the crucifixion, and guess what? He does it again over on the other side. It's an octagonal kind of shape, kind of embedded into the image. It's very interesting. All right, so Michelangelo, primarily a sculptor, but also painted, and so that's why a lot of his people in his paintings look like sculptures. So you got Moses, and that's in the Vatican, I believe. It's over a tomb. Is that what you said? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's over a tomb. Is it in the Vatican though? I don't remember. Sorry. And the other one, of course, is the Last Judgment and the behind the altar in the Sistine Chapel. So when the popes are deciding who's going to be the next pope, we see the final judgment in all its glory right in front of them. Speaking of the Sistine Chapel, we look on some of the sides. There's the murals on the sides of the walls. So on one side in the chapel, there's multiple ones, but this is just one of them. You see this is by Pietro Perugino. This fresco is the delivery of the keys. So Jesus giving the keys to Peter. So here in this room where the successor of Peter is to be named, here we see this is your authority that you're receiving is from Christ. So he's receiving the keys, and the key that's up, the gold key that's up, represents the mercy, because it's to bind or to loose. Those are the keys that. So it's the key of mercy that's looking up. You see in the architecture, I kind of had to cut off the sides here, but these are triumphal arches. So there's a lot of order. There's a lot of going on when you receive Christ's authority in the proper way. But then on the opposite side of the wall, this is juxtaposed with another painting. So there's the delivery keys. There you can see the triumphal arches better. But it's juxtaposed with an Old Testament story, the punishment of Korah in the Old Testament. So in the book of Numbers, in chapter 16, you have the story of the family of Korah revolts against Moses because they don't want the authority to be given to Aaron, or the priest to be given to Aaron. They want to be able to have some of that, and so they try to usurp Moses' authority. And so this painting of the punishment of Korah is showing forth the chaos of what happens when you try to usurp the proper means of handing on authority. So in here you've got the same triumphal arch in the center, but now it's falling apart. Disorder and chaos arises because they're not. And this is a different artist. The deliver the keys was Peregrino, and this is Botticelli. But they worked together on purpose, even though they were two separate artists. They worked together to juxtapose these images, and of course, I'm sure that they were given the assistance of the different prelates or the Pope at that time, and this is what we want in our chapel. So you can see as the cardinals are coming in to elect the new successor of Peter, there you've got the two options. Make sure you're being guided by the Holy Spirit. Don't try to usurp Christ's authority, because chaos will reign. Another Renaissance artist is Titian. This is the Assumption of the Virgin, and actually we have got a copy of it on the wall back there. Copy of Titian's Assumption. This is in Venice, is where you find this one. So you could do so much more with the Renaissance, but we're going to go look at the Baroque. All right, so in the Baroque, and the Pope says at its best, so not everything Baroque. Especially later Baroque. Later Baroque becomes Baroque. No. Baroque-in. No. Terrible puns. In the Baroque art, it's seeking to portray, so Gothic was seeking to portray on the journey. And Baroque art is seeking to portray the world after the fall. So you're going to see a lot more of this dynamic between light and darkness in Baroque. So the light here, for example, in this image of Rembrandt's Simeon's Song of Praise, the light coming from the Christ child, and it's dispersing throughout the temple. So you can see that the most important things in this image are the ones that are brightest, most in focus. Let's see. Another example, this one in sculpture. This is Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. This is in Rome. And what you find in Baroque, even though there's kind of especially in painting, there's this play between the light and darkness and a focus on the center event or individual. There's an emphasis of the whole person. So like facial features are not done in more detail than other parts of the person, whereas you tended to find that, for example, in icons, there'd be more detail in that part, or in the Gothic. So there, if we zoom in more into see the light and the darkness playing in the different crevices of the sculpture. And then, Rachel, do you want to tell us what that is?
That is the raising of the cross by Apologetic.
And where's it at?
It's in Antwerp, Belgium.
Cathedral of Our Lady. That's what it's called. I have the cheat notes here. No. Elevation of the cross, a triptych. So you can see that it's got it's got the middle and the two sides, and so it could be closed, and then there's another painting on the outside of something. But most of the time this one's open because it's awesome. So you can see the size of these. I mean, unfortunately we can't go visit all of these because they're at different places. So you have to look at pictures on a screen, and it doesn't really give the full glory of some of these pieces of artwork. So you just have to look at this. Sorry. But you can go see them on your own. So Ratzinger said about altarpieces, it's a window, and specifically about the Baroque altarpiece, which is what this is like a window through which the world of God comes out to us. The curtain of temporality is raised, and we are allowed a glimpse into the inner life of the world of God. This art is intended to insert us into the liturgy of heaven. So there's this breaking in, and this is a different dynamic than the iconographic tradition. As we'll see in a little bit, is that the icon, just as he says, is the world of God comes out to us. So in the icon, in a sense, we're drawn in to the heavens, but in Baroque, God is coming out to us. So we'll see in the way that they paint it, in a sense, it forces us backwards to say, you stay where you are, I'm coming to you. So we'll see that in a moment. But this is a set of two triptychs. And so there's, you can see it a little bit better, raising of the cross. And then it's paralleled with the, Rachel? Descent from the cross. So the descent from the cross. Rachel, do you want to make any comments about your own personal reaction to those?
I saw both of those in person in Belgium, and it was to see that one, especially the descent from the cross, and how it was very powerful because it was just seeing Jesus' body being taken down. Yeah, it was very moving.
Yeah. There's another, you were showing Rachel that there's a, don't remember who wrote this. Who is it? Anyway, but Sir Joshua Reynolds, yeah, there we go. Sir Joshua Reynolds, he pointed out it's like the very moment just before his body falls down, because there's not much holding him there at that moment. You can see there's, he's just barely he's about to fall down, and so there's this kind of dynamism there. There's a movement there. So when you are actually in his presence, the reality of death. So this, as you can see, there's this great contrast between light and darkness, which artists call chiaroscuro. Did I say it? Sorry, that's why I want chiaroscuro. Sorry, chiaroscuro. So the contrast between light and darkness. So they only put in the full and natural color the areas of the primary interest of the painting. And the rest are then shrouded in darkness. But what they're doing in this is they're mimicking the natural way that the eye works, because it happens with us. The thing that we're looking at is in our focus, it's the brightest and clearest, and then the other things in our periphery are out of focus and they're darkened. We may not think of that very often, but that's the way our eye works. And so it's depleted of the color, it's depleted of the focus, and so the Baroque painting is imitating that. It's imitating the way we naturally take something in. So it would be very comfortable for us. So this is Caravaggio's The Conversion on the Way to Damascus, St. Paul. This is another Caravaggio. We'll look at this a little bit more in a moment. It's the calling of St. Matthew. And so now let's talk about prayer with the Baroque art. This is the Christ on the Cross by Diego Velázquez, Spanish artist. And when Baroque art is meant to be viewed from a distance, if you try to get up close, what happens is things get out of focus. And you notice that they're not really sharp, and they're kind of, and like when you look at icons, when you get really close to icons or the Gothic, you can see all the detail much better. It's very detailed. And it becomes sharper as you get closer. But for the Baroque, it actually goes out of focus because the painters actually purposely painted that way, and they use a specific technique in order to get that effect. Is that they're painting it, they step back from it to view it, then they go forward to paint, and they step back, and so they're painting it so that the ideal point of view is back away from it. In fact, and these are nothing, I didn't know any of this stuff, so this was from the artist David Clayton that I was reading. He says that really the optimal distance is 3 times the largest dimension of the painting, of the work. That's the optimal distance to see it. So he lamented that some of these artworks that are in museums, it's impossible to get that far away from them, so you really can't take them in properly. They're meant to be in the church where you could be far enough away. So when these would be behind like an altar, say, you could be 3 times the distance away just naturally, because that's where you sat, or that's where you would be in the church. So what ends up is this 3-to-1 ratio is actually just slightly larger than the natural focus of our eye. So it fits in really well, even though I don't know if they knew that. Maybe they did. So you can take in the whole painting comfortably. So you can see, it's more, it's blurry or it looks unfinished. But then when you look from further away, there's a completeness to it. And I don't know if you guys are sitting 3-to-1, ratio 3-to-1, but so what this does is that if you try to come too close, it goes out of focus. So in one sense, it's pushing you back. You have to stay away from it. You have to stay further back in order to see it properly. And so David Clayton says, well, the image says, so to speak, you stay where you are. I'm coming to you. I am with you, supporting you in your suffering here and now. So it's God breaking into our world, coming down to us. Whereas the icons, the Gothic, is a sense of drawing us in. The Baroque, because it was painted to be seen from far away, is pushing us back, and God's coming to us. So you get this threefold dynamic with that. You've got God coming down to earth in the Baroque art. You've got our journey towards heaven, our pilgrimage in the Gothic art, and then you have our heavenly home through the icon. And of course, then God, once again, he comes down to earth from heaven to lead us. So you've got they work, they're complementary in all three of them, the styles. So, and I apologize that I'm long-winded. And we're over time. And so do you want to do some Lex Divina to finish? If you need to depart, you may depart. So we're going to finish and pray. So if you remember the steps, Lex Divina, we invoke the Holy Spirit to assist us. We're going to read the icon, looking at, see what do we see in this image. And then we'll meditate on it. What do those things mean? Then we'll pray. We'll respond to what we see. And then we'll take a moment in silence to let God speak to us. And then we'll end with some praise. So we'll ask invoke the Holy Spirit. And let's, at this point, stand. All right. So we're going to use this is the Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew. It's Baroque art. So let's begin with the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, enlighten our minds. Help us to see the beauty of your truth, your glory, through this work of sacred art. Help us to be drawn ever more into your life of love through it. So let's, for a moment, read the icon. So what is it that we see in this image? So go ahead and raise your hand if you to note something that we see in here.
Press modernized from the 1st century. He is bringing the truth of the events. The artist is bringing the truth of the events out to his audience. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he is. He's using they don't look like they're living in Palestine. Instead, Caravaggio would be Italian. So maybe the style of dress for the Italians of that time. What else do we see in there? Can you tell who's who? And how if I point out Christ in the corner, he's got you can see just the very glimpse of a halo, not the only spark of divinity that you can kind of see in this. This is Peter, right next to Jesus. This is Matthew, and those are fellow tax collectors, along with Matthew. So, any other thoughts, Ben?
I noticed the dark and light, so
yeah, you got the single light source from beyond, above Christ, maybe representing the Father, whereas the darkness comes from the other way. Any other thing?
Look on Matthew's face is like me.
Yeah, it's just like me or maybe that guy. No. Yeah, there is a surprise there. Anything else? What are the reactions of some of the others?
Well, I see that. I guess it's a window up there, but there's really no light coming there.
Yeah, there's not a lot of light coming out of the window.
So there's no earthly light, but there's that. Other
Yeah, it's an
light.
unknown source. It's an unknown source. We can't see the earthly source of that light.
So he's breaking into the darkness of this world.
Yeah.
The guy on the right, it's like he's kind of looking around him. No, on the right, on that right there. That guy. No, next to that one. It looks like he's looking around Peter. Around
Yeah, looking at something
on the other
else.
side.
Yeah. So he's in a sense almost missing what's going on, right? That's very true with these two, right? They're not even looking up at all. They're too focused on their money right now to even notice that Christ is even there. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, Jesus' hand. If you're familiar with Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam, Sistine Chapel ceiling, that hand is Caravaggio modeled it after God's hand. It's created Michelangelo's.
So
Yeah,
the hand.
it's like that.
Hand of the Creator. So another interesting element is that, it'll keep beeping. Sorry. Okay. You'll notice that Jesus' hand is going through Peter. So in a sense, there's this mediation of the church within this call. Let's see. Yeah, so
It's also interesting because the light source on Peter is not sure where that's coming from, but there is that source of light that's kind of, I guess, filling him then to share what he's sharing.
yeah. So we're kind of, as we're reading it, we're including also the meditations. The meditation is the explanation. Well, why do we see what we see? So some of the theology that goes into it. Why the light comes from the one side, or why it doesn't look like there's a source there. It's a theological light, a divine light. The great gap between the reactions to Christ's presence. Even though Matthew is befuddled as to the possibility of Christ meeting him, he still has raised his eyes to behold Christ's face, whereas those can't see what's right in front of them. They're so focused on their worldly desires that they can't even see them. So that's how we read by looking at what do we see. We meditate upon it by saying, well, why do we see what we see? And then next we pray. So we speak back to God. So for this part, we'll all kneel, and I'll lead a very short, audible form of the prayer, and then we'll pause and allow you to speak maybe to Christ, maybe to conversing with the saints are always good. So maybe with Matthew, maybe we see something within Matthew that is within ourselves as well. Lord Jesus Christ, we know that you come to meet us in the most ordinary of circumstances. When we might not even be looking for you at all. We might be caught up on all of the cares of the world around us, many important things, many good things with our families, and you come in and you say, I want to recreate you, to bring my light into this situation, to transform you. Help us to always recognize your inbreaking, whether it be through our personal prayer, maybe through others, maybe through the church, as this call comes through Peter as well. I'll be quiet a moment and let you enter into prayer. for prayer to truly be a conversation, we also have to remain quiet. We have to listen. And that's the part of contemplation. It's God's work. So we'll just simply look and listen to help us remain focused on listening. I've got some sacred music. This comes from the feast of St. Matthew. We'll finish with praise, so stand. And we'll use the text, the translation of the text of that, the introit for the feast of St. Matthew. And so we'll do together the first part, and then I'll do the verse, and then we'll repeat together the main part. So together. The mouth of the just man utters wisdom, and his tongue tells forth what is just. The law of his God is in his heart. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not envy those who do evil. The mouth of the just man utters wisdom, and his tongue tells forth what is just. The law of his God is in his heart. All right. Very good. That concludes our presentation. There's coming up next date is in January 9th. We'll talk about theology of church architecture. So welcome you all to come back. If you haven't had a chance to, if you've already signed back there, then don't worry about it. If you want to sign up to get an email reminder about when the next one comes, and it also tells you when I put things on the website, then feel free to sign up. Otherwise, thanks for coming.
Yep.